Hello, everybody, and welcome to Geopolitical Trends, where truth matters. I'm your host, Dr. David Walalu. It's always so great to be with you. I always get excited when I'm doing live, sharing time and knowledge with the community. So, let me say hi quickly to our wonderful community, then I'm going to get into the detail. Sankey NR. That's an interesting screen name. So, but you are right. US is being ruled, run by greed. I agree. Li Yang, good to see you. Rafael Lagan, as always, good to see you. YT, as always. Willie Holman, Taiwan Still, good to see you. Let me share with you some housekeeping items first, then I'll jump into the analysis about the delegation from Congress that went to China 2 days ago. So it makes you just wonder, what's the catch? So I'm gonna be having tomorrow. What's today? Today is tomorrow. So be on the lookout for my conversation with my upcoming conversation with Dr. Yasser Masood. Let me share the screen with you here. So I look forward to that conversation with Dr. Masood. Very, very interesting fella. So I'm also gonna be having a Giant Bahandari. So we are working on the time. But it will be within the next few days. And tomorrow at 1900 hours, I will be having a conversation with none other than Robbie Barwick. So you all know he's always here on the show. Hasn't been here for a while, but he's busy. So I look forward to my conversation with Robbie tomorrow, especially with what's going on in Australia. Did you guys know that Australia is reaching out to China behind closed doors? So of course they're afraid of their masters. So anyway, this is what I'm gonna be the guest we're gonna be have, and I am also working on others down the road for next week. So for today's topic, I will be addressing the visit by the U.S. lawmakers, which is usually a rare visit given where the tensions between the U.S. and China. So, and the question that, as a geopolitical analyst, I'm going to ask the simple question, does the United States want a deal with China? Because that's the only, what would you go to China for? If you are not seeking one way to break the ice, per se, with the Chinese in return for assistance or help. Because we see where things are getting here. So, and this is where you're going to have to ask yourself, is the US is realizing finally that it has been making shortcomings when it comes down to China? To me, it's as clear as daylight. Of course, the analysts in Washington from think tanks, from the Pentagon, from the DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, or even from the agency CIA, the analysis is going to be produced will not highlight this aspect. Why? Because they won't want to admit that. So what is interesting about all this is that the visit comes against the backdrop of so many other events. And I'm going to be listing 304 for you. I'll play a clip for you and I'll do the translation, simultaneous translation for it. Then we'll move into the analysis and move forward. So, like I mentioned, the visit, the US lawmaker sort of went to the US and met with number 2 leader, Premier Li Qiang, that you see on the picture right there. So the idea is that here is what's interesting. And to me, it's like the writing on the wall. They didn't talk about trade. They didn't talk about tensions. What they talk about? They wanted to talk about the military. In other words, they wanted to have a military dialogue. Makes you just wonder, is this because of the V-Day parade? And I'm going to get into that as I move forward. Of course, the US lawmakers are warning of the danger of a military misunderstanding with China. Well, wait a minute. Can't be stating those kind of statements in the air when you are provoking China. For example, sending lawmakers to Taiwan. What are you provoking China for? When we know we signed the 3 communiques, which, by the way, I'm going to provide you a chronological history of the U.S.-China relations, because this is also part of, if If the opportunity presents itself for me to teach in China, one of the courses I intend to teach is the US-China relations. So, and this is the idea of why you're looking now at the US lawmakers going there instead of addressing the really, I'm not saying the military aspect is not part of the conversation, but all of a sudden you are going and focusing on that when there have been issues that we've been creating on our part. How about addressing those first? Then we'll move on into whatever the delegation wants for. Suffice it to say that when a delegation like that goes to China, just to let you know, and this one based on a history of my dear friend, Dr. Dashwan Fang, who shared with me one particular, he had a visit with a representative from Congress at that time, 1979. And he is spot on this point that when this delegation goes to China, they're not going for tourism. You know what I mean? They're not going to hang out, whatever. They go in for some specific issues that needs to be addressed. This is no different. What makes it a rare visit, given what's been going on since 2019 during the COVID time, what's been happening, that it was no communication between the Chinese and the Americans. As a matter of fact, I was aware when the Chinese refused to meet at that time the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, Cheng Hu, if I'm not mistaken. He was the one, which, by the way, he was involved. The Chinese government clamped down on him for corruption. They found out and they dealt with him swiftly. Right way to deal with it. So suffice it to say that the trip by this bipartisan, meaning both parties, the Republicans and Democrats. This is the one in the middle here. That's the chair of the Armed Service Committee. He's the top Democrats, and the other two are Republican. And there's another Democrats. I didn't see the name there, so I didn't see the picture there. So, and of course, as I said, this trip came against the backdrop of so many things. For example, right 2 days after a phone call between President Xi Jinping and President Trump took place on Friday. The trip came after that one because now both countries, even though I will say more so the US than China, China has the upper hand, in my opinion. In my recent trip to China, I talked to some people, and again, for me, it wasn't about tourism. You all know this, because I want you guys to understand the truth as is. I asked people, and people with knowledge, and a simple question was, who holds the upper hand? They told me flat out, it's China. And this is, again, when announcements or statements or press releases coming out of Washington stating, President Trump and President Xi Jinping are trying to seek a course out of the period of strained ties. Well, who's more leaning towards that? Is the Americans, because we are in much more desperate need to resolve these issues than the Chinese. The Chinese moved on. Remember what we did with the chips ban? What did Huawei end up doing? They end up developing their own. They don't need NVIDIA anymore. So we miscalculated. Of course, the media here is going to have to mention, for example, the trade tensions, even though the delegation didn't go for that. They have to mention it. They have to mention the restrictions on the semiconductor chips, And one of the key things that I believe, it might have come up in the conversation, I'm not sure, I wasn't there, has to do with the ownership of TikTok. That is a major, to me, it's one of the, if I were to advise the Chinese government, I'd say don't sell. Because who's now on the list to own it is none other than Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch, who owned Fox. You all know what it means. And that's the picture I shared with the community when I put a comment there as far as to what lies ahead moving forward if and when TikTok became owned here in the US. It's I don't know whether it came up on a conversation or not. But here is where the media is misleading the masses, The delegation is not going there to talk about South China Sea. And yet the press release had to include that one. Here is what it says, specifically, Chinese, and I quote, Chinese activities in the South China Sea and matters related to Taiwan. Once again, what are we beating the dead horse here? We all know in the case of Taiwan, it is part of China. What are we making this fuss about when we signed the 3 communiques? The issue of the South China Sea. Where is the issue there? The issue is that the US is claiming this freedom of navigation, and when the Chinese did it near Alaska, we went crazy. The Russians did it too near Alaska. We went crazy. So, as a matter of fact, to my knowledge, the Pentagon now is working internally, whether they're going to release this information, and this is not classified, just to share, to let you know. They are working on changing the language of the legal aspects of the freedom of navigation, the legality of it. That's what now the Pentagon is working on. You all know what it means. So, and this is why they had to include this particular wording, Chinese activities in the South China Sea and matters related to Taiwan. But nonetheless, the delegation is saying, you know what, we want to sort of break the ice with the Chinese because of the tensions and so forth. And the delegation, which was headed by the Democratic U.S. Representative Adam Smith, that's the guy you saw in the center right there, which they all corrupted, by the way. So I don't care. They all corrupted. The whole Congress is corrupted. So now, when you think about Adam Smith's former position was he was the former chair and current top Democrats on the House Armed Services Committee. Armed Services Committee, like I told you last time, 3 subcommittees or committees I listen to in Congress, in the Senate, that is. The Sub-Intelligence Committee, the Armed Service Committee, and the Foreign Relations Committee. And to me, for not only learning, but also it gives me an idea as to what lies ahead regarding possibility of policies that the U.S. government is going to embark on. And here is what Adam Smith said, and I quote, "We can both acknowledge that both China and the U.S. have work to do to strengthen their relationship, which should not be, 6 years between visits from the U.S. House of Representatives." End of quote. This is what Adam Smith told Premier Li Qiang. Well, if I am to say this, and by the way, just to let you know, there is a tension regarding this trip that just took place between those members of Congress and Donald Trump, because this has nothing to do with the approval of Donald Trump. Congress does not need an approval for Donald Trump to do this. But Donald Trump is furious for that, because even Donald Trump himself is playing both sides. You remember in 2019 when he stated, and I'm paraphrasing here, see how tough I am on the Chinese? It's all about the damn politics here, domestically speaking. So I'm going to be playing a clip for you. I'm going to do the translation. Then I'll move on with the conversation here. So let's take a listen.
ثلاثة زعماء نوويين معادين للغرب يجتمعون على منصة.
And I will be doing the translation as we move on. 3 leaders that are opposed to the U.S. have been gathering in China.
واحدة في حدث.
Have been getting together on the same stage.
علنيا أمام العالم.
In a major event that is in front of the world.
وفي الصين.
And in China.
في استعراض أسلحة فتاكة لقوة.
And this in a parade where the exhibition of lethal weapons have been displayed.
عالمية مرعبة. الرئيس الروسي، الرئيس الصيني، وزعيم كوريا.
The Russian president, the Chinese president, and the North Korean president.
كوريا الشمالية. هي المرة الأولى على الإطلاق التي يحضر فيها زعيم كوريا الشمالية.
A first time ever that the North Korean leader is attending this event.
حدثا إقليميا متعدد الأطراف.
In a regional event that included so many other attendees.
بل ويصافح رؤساء العالم.
Not only that, he also had a chance to shake hands with other world leaders.
في عرض عسكري هو الأكبر
And this is during a military parade, one of the biggest
في تاريخ الصين
in China's history.
بمناسبة مرور 80 عاما على تحررها من الاحتلال الياباني.
And this is in commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the defeat of the fascism or the Japanese imperialism.
العرض كان مبهرا بمعنى الكلمة.
The parade was dazzling in true sense of the word.
فقد الرئيس شي جين بينغ الجنود من سطح سيارة
And the President Xi Jinping addressed the troops from the vehicle
هونجتشي المكشوفة
Honichi.
وقال إن نهضة الأمة الصينية لا يمكن.
And he said that this is what President Xi Jinping said: the Renaissance and the rise of the Chinese nation cannot be stopped.
إيقافها. شاهدوا أبرز اللقطات.
Take a look at these clips. By the way, the sound belongs to the Chinese military because that's their video. So I just want to give credit where credit is due. And this played through Al Jazeera, which I give credit to. By the way, this missile you're looking at, DF-61, this is the new level of the ICBM China developed, 15,000 kilometers. You know, usually the range for missiles from that part of the world to hit the US is about 11,920, to my knowledge, max of 12,000. This one here is 15,000.
عرض مبهر حقيقة.
Impressive parade.
بالانتظام والانضباط.
With the precision and the discipline.
كشفت الصين في هذا العرض لأول مرة عن.
And in this parade, for the first time, the Chinese exhibited
ثالوث نووي استراتيجي.
A strategic nuclear triad.
يعني 3 منصات إطلاق نووي.
Which means basically 3 launching platforms.
وهي برا بحرا جوا.
Air, sea, and land.
لمنحها قدرة الانتقام والردع المرن.
To give meaning China, that is the ability of a bitter deterrence. In other words, countries will have to think twice.
كلف هذا العرض العسكري ميزانية.
This parade cost about
لبكين أكثر من 36 مليار يوان.
More than 36 billion yuan, the equivalency of $5 billion.
أي ما يعادل 5 مليارات دولار. هذا يساوي 2% من
approximately 2% of the Chinese defense budget of this year.
ميزانية الدفاع الصينية للعام الجاري.
Okay, I'm going to stop right here because that's all it is for this particular thing. One thing is sure is the idea of when you saw the planes, you saw the missiles, and you saw, I think the submarine came up later on, the version of it. You know, that is when he said the nuclear triad. That's what the term we use in the US in English here, the interoperability, meaning the land, sea, and air, all of them converging into one operation, which requires a lot of coordinations and so forth. This is why it was very, very impressive. Now, to me, here is where it comes all this. This is one of the reasons why the delegation wanted to address with the Chinese. We need to get into the conversation regarding the military aspect. It's because they saw what China displayed. You saw this, I don't know, to those who saw the parade, there were some types of drones. That one will make an MQ-9 like a child play. Those are very, very advanced, the Chinese that displayed. So, but you all remember, sometimes with the trips of the lawmakers, they will do something like this, then they'll go on and agitate and provoke the Chinese. What am I referring to here? I am referring to how sometimes trips by US lawmakers will include also a stop in Taipei. So, which you and I know, Beijing claims that it's not claims, Taiwan is part of China. Simple as that. So, and if I am to use history as my guide, I'll take you back to 2022 when Nancy Pelosi at that time led an entire delegation. Yeah, an entire delegation to Taiwan as part of wider Asia tour. Why was she sort of provoking the Chinese for? It's because to China, and rightly so, they feel like, it's infuriating. In other words, you don't respect our sovereignty. You don't respect the agreement you signed with us. And that is why I had a TN made with this particular video saying, can you trust the Americans? So, no. And of course, Nancy Pelosi wasn't the only one to do this in 2022. A year later, none other than Michael McCaul. Michael McCaul was the chairman of the House of Representatives of Foreign Affairs Committee. He made the same trip to Taiwan. Once again, what for? So, and this is again why I'm convinced the idea of if we are to say we want to cooperate with the Chinese, but we turn around and provoke them. That just doesn't make any sense. Liking this video so far? Don't just be a watcher. Go ahead and hit the like, share, and subscribe button. And don't forget to tap the bell so you will not miss any of my videos or live streams. This way, you will be supporting a channel that stands for the truth and objective reporting. The choice is yours. Thanks for your support. As I mentioned earlier, I will be providing you, we're going to do a little bit of history here because it's very important to understand the stages of how the US-China relations have evolved over the time. And as I mentioned earlier, I am sort of thinking when that time comes for me to teach in China, one of the course that I intend to teach, assuming the institution will allow it and agree to it, has to do with the US-China relations. Why? I do believe the upcoming next generation of leaders inside China, the students that is, needs to understand that this is the US-China relations, is the single most important relationship that will define global affairs for the remaining of the 21st century. So, and how this relationship is managed and the decisions made by each side will have dramatic implications for the political, economic, and geopolitical stability of the world. That is the reason why I would like to teach that course in China, not here. I won't teach it here. So, and this is why I believe students will learn, for example, about the evolution of the US-China relations from the founding generation of the US all the way to the end of the Qin dynasty. And of course, you have to go through the Civil War, the Chinese Civil War, and the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, CPC, that is, to the warming of the relations under President Nixon and China's subsequent reform and opening period. So, and to me, it makes more sense. This is where the importance of history, addressing this history, in my opinion, will allow students to apply the theories learned in international relations to not only, and the way I look at it, because this is what you want to arm students with, the knowledge that will make more sense to them, will not only help them frame the challenge faced by both nations, but also provide a discussion about the current challenges in this particular relationship. That's to me the way I see it. So, but anyway, I am working on that one. In due time, it will happen. So let's go now to the time chronological, and I'm going to go all the way back to 1949. And briefly, I'm not going to detail much. I'll provide you the link for this, and we'll just go from there. So, now, the way you have to look at it is 1949. That's when the separation happened. This is regarding the Taiwan and China, but at the same time, there is the idea of thinking in terms of where this relationship or how it evolved. So 1949 all the way to 2025. And once again, I am going to do this very, very, very briefly. So you think about the United States and China. So it's the most complicated or bilateral relations that exist. And since 1949, 48, 49 actually, the two countries have sort of entangled into a periods of tensions. Sometimes cooperation, sometimes the tensions, and the tensions or the cooperation are revolved around the trade, the climate change, and one of them has to do with Taiwan. So when you think about October 1949, and that's when the People's Republic of China was established. So this is when you think of the Chinese party leader at that time, Mao Zedong, established the People's Republic of China in Beijing on October 1st. And of course, you all know the history of it, and I'm not going to get into the details. Suffice it to know at this period that the United States, which backed the nationalists against invading Japanese forces during World War II, supported Chiang Kai-shek's exile of the Republic of China, his government, to Taipei. This is what you need to understand. And this basically set the stage for several decades of limited U.S. relations with mainland. Fast forward to 1950. What happened in 1950? Of course, you think about the Korean War breaks out, and that in itself, of course, the Soviets backed North Korea at that time, which entered the South Korean on June 25th. And the United Nations, which is, to me, it's toothless anyway, the United Nations and the United States rushed to South Korea's defense. On the other hand, China in support of the communist North Korea. That's what they did. So, and of course, when the U.S. And South Korean troops approached the Chinese border, as many as 4 million people died in the 3-year conflict until the United Nations, China, and North Korea signed an armistice agreement in 1953, which, by the way, technically the war has never ended. So. Move to 1954. Why is this important? Because this is the first Taiwan Strait crisis that took place. And of course, it was none other during the tenure of Dwight Eisenhower, who's the one who lifts, at that time, the U.S. Navy blockade of Taiwan in 1953. So, and that's what led Chiang Kai-shek to deploy thousands of troops to the Quemoy and Matsu Islands in the Taiwan Strait in August 1954. So, and of course, the mainland People's Liberation Army, PLA, responded by shelling the island. So, of course, Washington at that time signed the Mutual Defense Treaty with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. So, and in the spring of 1955, the United States threatened a nuclear attack on China. And that April of that year, 1955, China agrees to negotiate, and they did, by claiming a limited victory after the nationalists withdrew from the Dachen Islands. So, 1959, very, very important. Of course, why is this important? Because that's where the tensions rose in the other side, in the Tibet area. So, 1964, why is that important? In 1964, that's when China's first atomic test, because they had to. Because when the U.S. threatened China with the nukes, Chinese didn't have to. Doesn't take genius to figure this out. You have to. So China joined the nuclear club in October 1964 when it conducted its first test of the atomic bomb. 1969. Why 1969 is important? That's when the Sino-Soviet borders conflict erupted. So, of course, when you look at history, and again, I'm just providing you a brief snapshot on this, the differences over security, ideology, and development models strained that relationship between the Soviet Union at that time and China. And of course, given how things were inside China, it didn't help matter. And that is why the disagreement culminated in a border scrimmages in March of 1969. So, and that in excuse me, and that in its Moscow replaced Washington as China's biggest threat, and the Sino-Soviet split contributes to Beijing's eventual rapprochement with the United States. This is one thing that we are working just to, the reason why I share history, and again, to make a point for you. This is why we are now trying to figure out a way of how to separate Russia from China. It's not going to work this time around. It won't. There is no way. There is no way. Why? Because the geopolitical landscape, the global one that is, has shifted in a different direction from what it used to be back during this era. So, move to 1971. This era is known for what was known in the political circles as the ping pong diplomacy. That was known for, and this is what the first sign of warming relations between Washington and Beijing. So, and of course, China's ping pong team invited members of the U.S. team to China on April 71. That's when, April 6th to be exact, 1971. So, and of course, it was one of the events for propaganda, and so the U.S. Washington ended up sending journalists. Also accompanied the U.S. players, and among the first Americans allowed to enter China since 1949. What is interesting about this era here, and I'm going to show you a picture here. What is very interesting about this era is when Kissinger, so that's what's important about this. In 1971, to be exact, in July 71, back then, Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, made a secret trip to China. And shortly thereafter, the United Nations recognizes the People's Republic of China. That's why endowing it with the permanent Security Council seat that has been held by Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China and Taiwan since 1945. So, and to me, if the UN is doing this, right there around the world, and the whole world is saying this, that means if you are recognizing the People's Republic of China as the main representative and the sovereign state, so removing Chiang Kai-shek, because if you remove that, that means it's not a sovereign. If it's not a sovereign, that means it does not have an independent state as some claim. And this is where the trick of the U.S. approaching this is just playing it both sides. When we see the Chinese get angry and upset, we kind of ratchet down. Oh, we won't go to Taiwan, whatever. The moment relations gets back to normal, we'll provoke the Chinese. 1972, of course, that's famous for Richard Nixon's visit, which he spent, by the way, 8 days in China. So 1972. So, and that is where the important part starts. 1972. What's important about it is that that's when Nixon met Chairman Mao, and it was not only just a meeting, it was also the signing of the Shanghai Communique with Premier Zhou Enlai at that time. And the communique that was signed, the first one, 1972, set the stage. And that's again where we don't respect agreements. Set the stage for the improved U.S.-Sino relations by allowing China and the United States to discuss difficult issues, specifically the issue of Taiwan. So, and that's when it started. So 1972. 1979, that is where the formal ties regarding the one China policy, because in 1979, it was the second communique was signed. So, and that's when President at that time, U.S. President Jimmy Carter, grants China full diplomatic recognition while acknowledging mainland China's one China principle, which means the sovereignty over Taiwan, because Taiwan is part of China. That is what so many have a hard time and understand. I do know for a fact, during my days in Washington, I do know policy makers know this reality. They just sometimes, for political reason, they play it dumb. Oh, no. We're gonna still can provoke the Chinese through this. But they know, at least to those who are familiar with the history, Taiwan has always been part of the of China. So, and this is where sort of the Chinese vice premier at that time, Deng Xiaoping, led China through major economic reforms. What did he end up doing at that time? He visited the United States shortly thereafter. So, yet, in April of the same year, 1979, Congress approves the Taiwan Relations Act, and that allowing the continued commercial and cultural relations between the United States and Taiwan. That act requires Washington. It is the wording of the legislation. This is where we play with politics. Requires Washington to provide Taipei with defensive arms, but not officially violate the United States one China policy. How can you be doing, this is not a way of doing business. This is not a way of conducting yourself diplomatically with a sovereign state. So, and we signed the communique. 1992. This is during the era of none other than Reagan. So, Reagan administration issues at that time about, to my knowledge, 5 or 6 assurances. I don't remember, because I remember just reading it vaguely. But and those assurances, they weren't assigned to China. They were assigned to Taiwan. So, and one of them that I remember vividly is that the pledge that it will honor the Taiwan Relation Act. So, but there is nothing says about we will come to the defense of Taiwan. The politicians in Taiwan are delusional. They are living in some fancy land thinking that should the first shot is fired, we will come to the rescue. We will not. Mark my word on it. So the same act, the US said that it will not mediate between Taiwan and China. So what are we provoking the Chinese? Let the Chinese deal with the representatives in Taiwan. Because to me, and again, I speak for myself, to me, Taiwan is just another state. It's like here in the US. We have the state of Texas. We have the state of California. The governor in either state can say whatever, and he can enter into negotiations with the presidents regarding policy, whatever. But will another country comes in and interfere into this? No, because it's domestic affair. Simple as that. What's interesting about 1982, that's when we signed the third communique. We didn't sign it with Taiwan. We signed it with the People's Republic of China to normalize relations, but also to confirm the one China policy. So actually, the way I look at it, and again, when I see now what's going on in Hong Kong, the development in Hong Kong, I went through Hong Kong at the airport, and I found out they are building the third runway in Hong Kong. I'm going to ask you something. Was there any developments when Hong Kong was still under British? I won't use the term control, but sort of the British mandate. None. It was till the Chinese took Hong Kong back, and what they end up doing, it's not that China controls the whole Hong Kong, no. And I was there and I saw they kind of letting them do whatever they wanted. It's sort of semi-autonomous. It's the same argument I can make because I saw in Macau. They said they just live in the life, they move in with infrastructure and so forth and improvements. I mean, if you guys see that bridge that links Macau to motherland, unbelievable. And the same thing in Hong Kong. China went ahead and started to invest in developing Hong Kong. They didn't control it. The same argument. Because if you go to Taiwan and you go to certain areas, it's like, is this, China will not allow this kind of setting to be. We're not talking about ideology here. We're talking about crumbling some parts of infrastructure inside Taiwan. Why? Because it was never an interest in upgrading the infrastructure inside Taiwan. Because most of the money was geared towards buying weapons from the US. So suffice it to say, in 1982, the third communique was signed with China. 1989, of course, you all know what happened, but you all know who fomented that, claiming to be this the Tiananmen Square tensions that we all know how that happened, right? 1993, this is where you have the deportation of Wei Jiangchen. He was a political opposition guy. He was released or whatever, deported from the mainland. So 1996, this is Taiwan's the so-called, I don't like to use the term presidential, because to me there is no president in Taiwan. To me it's the equivalency of a governor. But anyway, this is part of what history is stating, but the history that is documented here in the West, that's what I'm sharing with you. The wording can be very, very tricky. So 1996 was Taiwan's the presidential elections that took place. Of course, 1999, you all know what happened in Europe. That was when the Chinese embassy was targeted in Belgrade. That wasn't an accident. I'm here to tell you. I had a chance to read the report, the internal part of it. Wasn't an accident. So, and of course, that's what NATO said accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during its campaign against Serbia. Well, first of all, why the heck would NATO be bombing in Serbia? That's just Serbian forces occupying Kosovo, and in May 1999, and that is what sort of rattled the U.S.-Sino relations at that time, because the United States, when you think NATO, you think the United States, offer apologies and so forth, but the U.S. intelligence mistakes that led to the deadly bombing, you're looking at thousands of Chinese demonstrators protested throughout the country, and rightly so. 2000. Now I remember this vividly. I was still in the military at the time. So 2000 was the normalized trade relations between the United States and China, and that was during the time of Bill Clinton. So, and they signed it legislation in Congress under what was known or still known as the U.S.-China Relations Act of 2000. So, and that in itself granted Beijing permanent normal trade relations with the United States and paving the way for China to join the WTO. So, one other major event that I was aware of, there was not a lot of conversation about because, it involves intelligence, and that has to do with the 2001 U.S.-Sino spy plane standoff. I was aware of the plane that went into the Hainan Island. It was a recon plane at that time. And that's the one that collides with the Chinese fighter, and we has to make emergency landing on a Chinese territory. So you ask yourself, what are we doing with a recon plane over the Chinese territory? Simple as that. So, of course, there was the intervention of the George Bush at that time, and expresses regret over the death of a Chinese pilot and the landing of U.S. planes. 2005, this is where you start having sort of the tension start to emerge regarding trade. But 2005 marked this sort of strategic dialogue with China. It's exactly what the delegation now claiming to be doing, or what it did during its visit to China. So, but this one was slightly different. Why? It's because at that time in 2005, the Deputy Secretary of State, Robert Zoellick at the time, initiated the strategic dialogue, but it wasn't for the aim of improving relations with China. That wasn't the aim. So, of course, the American side stated that we recognize Beijing as an emerging power. So, and Zoellick at the time, calls on China to serve as a responsible stakeholder. First of all, you don't call on a country to serve. The country can decide for itself. That just, to me, shows the arrogance and superiority oh, we're going to ask you to serve as. No, Chinese can decide for themselves. And again, to me, it's just common sense, diplomatically speaking. So, but what the US wants, that's why I said it was no honesty. It wasn't about improving the relations with China. It was about China using its influence to draw nations such as, at that time, Sudan, North Korea, and Iran into international system. Because what those have in common, that they never bow to the US pressures. Still till today, Iran, after almost 40 years of sanctions, did not bow and will not bow to US pressures. So, and the same year, North Korea walked away from the 6-party talks aimed at curbing North Korea's nuclear ambitions. I was following that, and right there, when they did that, I said, that's it, North Korea is in possession of a nuclear weapon. We dare to threaten them now. And that's exactly what happened. Right after that, North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in October 2006. So China did serve as a mediator, but it was too late for that, because the North Korean at that time said, you know what? We're done negotiating with you. We are a nuclear power. And that's again what I say. Iran might end up having to go the same route. So, yeah. 2007 marks, that's when Washington started to notice. And again, I was still in Washington. One of the key topics that was circulating across the agencies within the government in Washington at that time has to do with 2007. Why is 2007, you may ask? Because that's when Washington noticed the increase in Chinese military defense spending. And to me, was like at that time just wondering, okay, why is this a big deal? Look our defense. And at that time, that was about $450 billion, I remember. So, and China's increasing it by literally a minimum. They won't even get closer to that number. And yet, we made it a priority. Why is this? To keep the narrative alive. And that narrative is, oh, we're going to have to fear China. That's what it was. So, and at that time, the Chinese increase was about 15, if I recall, 15, 18, 20. No more than 20, no more than that. So increase. Well, it makes more sense because at that time, China was growing economically. So when you grow economically, you're going to have to grow militarily to protect your asset. The same thing we did after World War II. So what makes it okay for us and not for the Chinese? Or any country for that matter who could have the same outcome as China, which I don't see any other country in the world at this time. Forget about India. Modi's claiming, oh, we're going to now be the hub of the global chip manufacturing. So I'll be talking with the giant Bahandari about that. So, and this was very important to understand from 2007. And why is it from 2007 forward? It's important because that's when a shift was made inside Washington. I witnessed that in front of my eyes. The shift has to do with the assets from the West Asia or Middle East into Asia. Why? Because the narrative starts to build up as to the next threat is coming from China. 2007. These things didn't start yesterday. I'm here to tell you. And this is why it became clear to Washington, especially in 2008, when China becomes the largest US foreign creditor. We were asking China for money. That invasion of Iraq, and I'm here to tell you because I know the facts. That invasion was on the credit cards. And guess where we get the money from? Borrowed, of course, from China. So, and yet, look at the country here. Look at where the infrastructure is and so forth. So, 2010, and that's where the nail hit the coffin, per se, on the American thinking regarding China. Why? 2010, because China becomes the world's second largest economy. And of course, China surpassed Japan as the world's second largest economy, because you all know what happened in the 80s We never wanted to let Japan move. We sank in the economy of Japan quietly. And that is where China surpassed Japan as the second largest economy, as it was valued back then, 2010, at about 1.4, somewhere around that $1 trillion. And that was just for the second quarter of that year, because it was a major news at that time. And that's exactly what came after this. That's it. All now the policies will have to pivot towards Asia, and that's where the U.S. pivoted in 2011. It was an essay at that time written by Hillary Clinton, because he was the Secretary of State at the time, outlined that the U.S. pivot to Asia. What the State Department at that time called for is the increase in investments, diplomatic, economic, strategic, and otherwise. That word otherwise, in my opinion, refers to tensions regarding Taiwan. So that's and 2012, this is where you start to see the rising trade tensions, because we didn't like the direction where China was going. In other words, going to the top, the ladder. It is sending to the global supremacy. Chinese, by the way, just to let you know, and I asked someone inside China, I was told they don't like to brag. It's not like our culture. They don't brag, and I could see that. You never know the person you're talking to. He could be a millionaire before you know it, but you will never know. They just like modesty. The same thing for their governments. They don't like to brag about we are number one, or they even care for that. They keep a low profile. But what I was told is that, the idea that we think that we are number one and China number two, the Chinese is letting us believe that, and they don't say a word about it. You all know who number one is. And this in 2010, why those trade tensions is because China deficits with the US, rather, deficits with China at that time reached about $270 billion. Just think about it. Think about it. Most of our debt held by the two countries, China and Japan. And this is again where, and of course, 2012, it was the major, the 18th. As a matter of fact, that book over there, you see right there, was given to me by a dear friend of mine. I'm reading all the statements by President Xi Jinping as far as his vision from that time, 2013. Very, very impressive, and I'm still reading. It's a thick book. 2012, that's when the Chinese new leadership came in, and that's where President Xi Jinping came to power, 2013. And it was right after that, the summit between President Xi Jinping and Barack Obama at that time. What else after this? That's about it. Those are 2015, the U.S. issued warning to China over South China Sea. That's just, once again, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But this is, again, you don't take it lightly. It's because the Pentagon is working on changing the legal terms of the freedom of navigation, so-called freedom of navigation. 2017, you all know, marks when Donald Trump affirmed, here is the key, Donald Trump in 2017 affirmed one China policy after raising doubts. Trump, you don't know with Trump, because Trump is not, doesn't possess depth when it comes down to understanding geopolitics, international relations, international security, or even how global affairs, when it comes down to dealing with other countries. Trump is not equipped for that. Yes, he deals with business in his own way, whether in an honest way or not, ain't my place to judge for that. But suffice it to say that Donald Trump says he will honor, this is back in February 9th, 2017. He said that he will honor the one China policy in a call with President Xi Jinping. That was just after winning the presidential elections, meaning Trump winning the presidential elections. And Trump breaks with establishing practices by speaking on telephone with Taiwanese president at that time, Tsai, which, by the way, still her PhD is still questionable. I know there've been some court issues. I have documents in one of my other laptops. I got a few. The document, I got it from the University, the London School of Economics, when it says he pursued that, and I pulled up all the record, and I did find a dissertation, but it was no confirmation of who the committee chair or the members of the committee. To those who go through the PhD process, you know what I'm talking about, which means, in my opinion, it was never conferred, but for some other, I don't know, because when I was in Taiwan, it was one particular individual demonstrating in the street, holding a sign, and it says, Tsai is a liar. She never hold a PhD. And I remember I did a live stream for you about it from Taipei. So, and that's when you started to think in terms, now you start to question the commitments of the US regarding the one China policy. So which by the way, Washington has adhered to for 4 decades. And under this particular policy is that the United States will maintain its formal ties, not with Taipei, it's with Beijing, it's with China. So at the same time, it could have a relationship, an official one, with Taiwan, because when you have members of delegations of Congress, policymakers going to Taiwan on an official visit, that's problematic. And 2017, the same year, Trump hosted Xi at his resort in Florida. And 2018, that's where everything went down, when Trump issued tariffs targeting China. And it wasn't about China, it was about the progress China has achieved. So, and 2018 was another speech by none other than Vice President at that time, Mike Pence, who signaled the hardline approach to China. So I'm telling you, they just back and forth. And 2018 also marked a major event, and I covered it a lot. It has to do with the arrest, the illegal and unjust arrest of Meng Wanzhou. You all remember her, right? The Huawei executive, the daughter, which was illegally arrested in Canada by orders of the United States, because I was aware of a memo that was sent from the White House all the way to the at that time dictator Trudeau's government, asking him to arrest her illegally, unjustly. And that created the problems between the relationship. Of course, 2019, Huawei had the right to sue the United States. I don't know what came out of that legal lawsuit. So, the same year, the tensions regarding trade intensified. So, and that is where, when we couldn't compete with the Chinese, we start to figure out just whatever. Like, for example, we have labeled China in 2019 as a currency manipulator, just because we couldn't compete. So, and that is why led to the demonstrations in Hong Kong. You remember 2019, because Trump signed a bill supporting Hong Kong. Well, you all know how that happened. So even those who were arrested declared that they were funded by entities from the United States. What else? COVID in 2019. I'm not going to talk much about that one. And in 2020, Trump ended Hong Kong special status at the time. What else? And one thing that I remember, Pompeo used to be Secretary of State, former CIA director, which was a Chinese hawk. I'm aware of his approach to China. Sort of declared publicly, our engagement with China failed. That was for a reason. So to keep the narrative going, and that gives justification for neocons and hardliners in Washington to keep pushing. This is why Trump is doing what he's doing, because Trump has no say into what's going on. And this is why Trump ramps up pressure as transition looms, only to say, see how hard I am on China. That's all it was. So, and of course, 2021, we came up with something that proved to be a lie. It has to do with Uyghurs, so-called the genocide, which was none of it in Xinjiang. You all know how it is. So, as a matter of fact, I do plan on going there next year. I'll let the community know about this because I want to see with my own eyes, interview people there. But it's already been proven that it was nothing but a lie. So, and of course, Biden in 21 maintained those tariffs, and this is where the transition, the main one, happened in July 2021, and that's where the U.S. urged NATO. It is the key. I did a video for you. Go on the record, check it out. 2021 video about NATO, because that's what the U.S. urged NATO to declare China as a security threat. I mean, just beyond belief. Look where China is. Look where NATO is. Geographically, it just doesn't make any sense. But we want to head anyway. As a matter of fact, Japan is willing to host NATO's office in Tokyo. Now you don't hear much about it, but I still don't believe it. They're still moving into that direction. So, and this is 2022. You all know what happened 2022 in China, the Olympics. And what did the U.S. do? Boycotted it diplomatically. Why? Because we didn't want to see China. And we know when the Chinese get into something, they do it the right way. Look at the military parade. Look at the precision. Look at the what they call in debate, the accuracy, precision and accuracy, just how things done right. So we didn't want, because we knew that China is going to overshadow the U.S. regarding. And 2022, that was Biden presses President Xi, on Russia's war in Ukraine. So we started to see if we can push China away or pull China away from Russia. It's not going to work. I argued in my Russia book about it. And the major event, like I mentioned earlier, 2022, when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan. So there is, and I'm going to end it right here. So let me go back to my analysis. I hope this history at least provides you some insights into understanding the involvements, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to teach this course in an academic institution in China, when the opportunity presents itself, because I feel it is important for the next generation of leaders inside China to have a better understanding on this, and it will make more sense coming from a Western perspective, not as far as pushing the narrative this way or that way. No, it's not about that. It's about the idea of how. And for me, I am neutral. You all know me by now. It's what's subjective. And I feel the importance of a course like that. So now, when we think about the key points, I mentioned to you some key points that you need to know, and I'm going to go through them briefly here. So the three other key points that happened against the backdrop of this visit has to do with three items. One is upcoming midterm elections in the US. Two is gold prices. And three has to do with the People's Bank of China. So I'm going to detail each one of you, provide you at least my own insights regarding. So midterm elections in the US. Why is this important? It's because that's going to define the control inside Congress. But how are you going to do that? Is by saying, look, we reached out to China, we negotiated, we kind of resolved the tensions that the Republicans have created. This is what the Democrats are aiming at. Because the next US midterm elections, which will be held in November 2006, I know it's still far away, but it's not far in an election term, season that is. So the elections basically will determine the makeup of the 120th US Congress, and will be held during President Donald Trump's second non-consecutive term. They want to get ahead of it by saying, we reached out to the Chinese, we talked to them, so you're going to have to vote for us. When in reality, both parties, the Republicans and Democrats, two faces of the same coin, as corrupted as it gets, there is no one to vote for. And again, Americans, if you are an American watching this, you are free to do whatever you want. You vote for whomever. Just look how things have turned out when people voted for Trump. Look where things are. And what's coming is worse, even with what Donald Trump is doing. So gold prices is another key aspect that you need to understand. It's very, very, very important to understand. Why is this important? It's because gold rose about 20, almost 19%, as of yesterday. You're talking about a new record level, and boy, this one, it was sort of pushed chiefly by an increased have demand in recent comment from the Federal Reserve officials. This is why gold went up to 3,780 an ounce. That's an increase of almost 9%. So, and that tells you very, very important story you need to understand and you link it to what China is doing. And that makes more sense why the delegation will have to go to China now, not next month, not in 6 months from now. It's all about other dynamics. Here is what the People's Bank of China is doing. The People's Bank, which is smart move in my opinion. The People's Bank of China is using the Chinese gold market to encourage its allies to deposit their gold reserves in China. Why is this important? Because it will strengthen Chinese influence in the global financial market. And that in itself will automatically reduce the dollar dominance. Just smart move, I will say. So that is why the Chinese are moving into that direction. You have to understand these dynamics. It will make more sense to you. So as of yesterday, September 23rd, and that was reported here in the US by Bloomberg, reported, and I quote, China plans to promote itself as a custodian of other countries' gold reserves to strengthen the global gold market, end of quote. But at least one thing that the article didn't want to mention is that China is not going to behave the same way as the US. Because what does the US do to other countries when they deposit their gold? They ain't getting it back. Look at Venezuela, look at Iran, look at Saudi Arabia, look at Germany. Even for England, still has the stolen gold from Venezuela. Still have the stolen gold from India. It will make more sense to return the gold to its rightful owner. At least that's something China's not going to do. And I bet on it. China will not do that. But that doesn't mean China should not present itself as a custodian for other countries' gold. And other countries will be willing to do it. You know why? It's because the economic prowess of China. Compare that to the US. It makes more sense. It will be a safe haven. It will be safer to deposit your gold in China than to deposit them in the US, given the fluctuation of the dollar. And this is why China is moving into this direction. And the last one, which I didn't mention earlier, there were 4. The last one has to do with the US dollar. Guess what happened? Once again, yesterday, the US dollar tanked by about 10%. And by the way, the decline has been tracked since Donald Trump took office. Since he took office, that is what's been noticed, that the dollar has been declining. I mean, look at just what Trump has behind him right here. Trump gold card. All this is about Trump using the White House to enrich himself and his family. If this is not corruption, I don't know what is. This is the difference why most countries, in my opinion, will go ahead and deposit their gold reserves in China, but not in the US. So the gold, as I mentioned, the gold went down, and as there is his name is Paul Graham. Paul Graham is involved with the poorer and combinator. He's the co-founder of this company. And he said, and I quote, "You are becoming poorer," referring to the Americans, because now, as of literally yesterday or the day before, Americans now need an 11% increase in a net worth just to maintain purchasing power following the dollar's significant decline since President Trump took office. Let me repeat that, especially for my American audience. We, all of us, not just you, we, all of us Americans, we need about 11% increase in net worth just to maintain purchasing power following the dollar significant decline since Donald Trump took office. But again, that's what people voted for. So they deserve what is happening to them. And that is how now you are seeing the two countries, China and the US. This is why the delegation went. The delegation didn't go to China to just talk about whatever. The delegation went to China because they are concerned. They are seeing where the trajectory is going and is not to the US favor. Media here is not going to disclose this truth to the American people. Even some social media platforms, they won't want to disclose this. Whether they are being sponsored by the government, it's their prerogative. I don't care. But the idea is, you don't hear truth as much as it ought to be, to understand why the Chinese now are going for the gold, why the US dollar is going down, and why this delegation ended up going to China, not waiting for Donald Trump. Even though Donald Trump said, I'm going to be meeting with President Xi, soon at the beginning of the year, if not sooner. So, Donald Trump wanted to show and give a hint to Beijing that, I am trying to work with you here, whatever. So within reality, you can't trust Trump. You can't trust. It was an article written by Mohammed Al-Manshawi. He's a researcher and a writer, specializes in American affairs. Really did a good job on one article. I'm going to share it with you later on. And basically, what he's arguing is that U.S. policy circles were shaken. And why they were shaken? To watch what happens when, for example, the China displayed the weapons of advanced military systems. So, and that in itself has sort of caught the U.S. by surprise. That's why the delegation went over there. And by the way, Donald Trump said declining now to approve military aid to Taiwan. Yeah, that's what he's saying. Are you going to trust Trump? First of all, even if most likely it might happen, but guess why? You know why? Because that amount is only $400 million in comparison to $6 billion to Israel. So his argument is, we just say this way we'll show a good faith to the Chinese that we're not going to sell weapons. 400 million is nothing in weapon sales. But he is going with the $6 billion with the Israelis. So, and that it tells you the story right there. And this is why you need to understand, and I'm wrapping this up because I'm going to conclude here. This is why you need to understand the purpose of this delegation's visit to China. So to put it in perspective for you, because you need to understand these dynamics. And I will be talking even more about this with some of my guests as I move forward next week. So hope you guys enjoyed this, listened, learned something. And let me see if there is any question from you. First of all, I want to say thank you to Raj Shelley from Newport. Thank you so much for your super sticker, for supporting the channel and the content. I'm very, very grateful to you. So I appreciate it. And thanks to all those who are supporting the channel. So speaking of the channel, where is my link? Yeah, here is the link for the channel if you want to support the channel here on Buy Me Coffee. And I appreciate that one. So, okay, let me see if there's any question from you. Laurie, oh, that's an interesting comment. I wish Canada will deal more with China. Yeah, Canada is gone. Sad to say. I lived in Canada back then, and I used to think of Canada was really a great example for the rest of the world, but it's gone. It's gone. Canada's gone, sadly. So, but again, you saw it. You kind of they dug themselves into that environment. So, following America is not going to lead you into the right direction. So, in any event, remember tomorrow to join me for my conversation with Ravi Barwek. I look forward to that conversation. And on Friday morning, I will be having a conversation with Dr. Yasser Masood. I look forward to that conversation. For Giant Bahandari, we have not confirmed the timing yet. Once I find out, I will let you know. So, as always, remember, geopolitics impact your daily life in more ways than one. Till next time. Bye-bye.